as my loyal viewers will know, you can see from my background that I am once again back in the Scranton, Pennsylvania location and not on the farm. I got tired of all the internet glitches that were going on with these YouTube videos on the farm. And so, yeah, I've restored internet to the Scranton house. And so we're back, baby. And so hopefully we won't have any more of the internet gremlins that we've had. I am excited once again because I have a great guest today. Father, Dr. Eduardo, help me pronounce your, I've never had to actually say your last name out loud.
Echeverria.
Echeverria. Okay, Echeverria.
It rhymes with Ave Maria, I always say.
Echeverria. Okay, very good. Good. Because I didn't know if it was Echeverria or Echeverria, so that's good. It's always good to get it from the source.
Yeah.
And Dr. Echeverria, Dr. Echeverria, got his PhD in 1981 from the Free University in Amsterdam, Holland. That was 1981. You got a BA in philosophy as well at Trinity Christian College, 1973. Are you a convert by somebody?
Well, I was raised Catholic. Went to Catholic schools. My parents immigrated legally. I always add quickly, we immigrated from Merida, from Yucatan, Mexico, to New York in 1952. Went to Catholic grade schools, Catholic high schools, and all boys, Marist Brothers, Mount St. Michael Academy. So I was raised Catholic, but I didn't respond to the gospel. I responded to the gospel in an evangelical Protestant context in Switzerland at the L'Abri Fellowship. I don't know if you ever heard of Francis Schaeffer.
Frankie Schaeffer. Oh, yes.
Well, Frankie, that was the son of Francis Schaeffer. I don't have any. Frankie Schaeffer completely disowned his legacy. Francis Schaeffer was an evangelical Protestant. He was, I remember Newsweek, or was it Time Magazine, wrote an article on him once, calling him the intellectual pastor.
Right. I thought he was called Frankie too, though. That's why I
No, never. No, never.
Oh, okay. I guess I was confusing that with his son. But I used to read the Francis Schaeffer the Elder when I was in my evangelical phase in my youth. Right. And I thought the same. I thought, wow, this guy is like an intellectual pillar in the evangelical
absolutely.
movement.
The God who is there, escaped from reason. He is there, and he is not silent. The church at the end of the 20th century. Yeah. He was at its core, he was right about the flow of the culture and all of that.
So anyway, so finished your before.
So I responded to the gospel in that context, committed my life to Christ, and for about 20 years, I went through evangelical Protestantism, the Reformed tradition, in particular the Dutch Reformed tradition, Abraham Kuyper, Bavinck, Herman Boyeveld, all of that, and then Anglo-Catholicism. And then in 1992, I like to say this: I went ahead into the Catholic Church, rather than I don't like to describe myself as a revert, because that suggests that those 22 years were somehow just wasted time, and I was just going back. No, I went ahead into the Catholic Church, and much of what obviously not everything that I learned and affirmed is compatible with Catholicism, but I think much of it helped me to then go forward into the church, and that was in 1992. I taught while I was actually teaching at Malloy College in Long Island. It was a college founded by Dominican sisters, and then in 1996 went and taught at Conception Seminary College in Missouri, a Benedictine seminary. And then in 2003, I went to Sacred Heart. Yeah, Sacred Heart Seminary. So I've been there since 2003.
And that's basically how I've known your career. We've never met in person, but I've read many things that you've written. Always been a fan of your writings, and a friend of Janet Smith and other people, Robert Fastigi, at Sacred Heart Seminary. So you're part of a great group. You also have You got an STL, a Pontifical University of St. Thomas in Rome in
Right.
2009 as well. So you're very credentialed. And what I want to talk about today is Pope Francis, the legacy of Vatican II.
Right.
Okay, right there. There's the
That's
book.
the second edition. The first edition, I always say, I was trying to, and I mean this with full respect, I was trying to save Francis. So I was trying to locate him with respect to the tradition, with respect to John Paul II, with respect to Benedict, with respect even to St. Vincent of Lerins, because even then he was fond of citing. But then after a few, that was in 2015, I believe my book came out, the first edition. But then after a few years, it just became almost impossible to provide that kind of safety net, as it were, for him.
Okay, so let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here.
Okay.
Because there are like a million things that I could ask you. Lately,
right.
as many people who follow my blog know, I've had some articles in the National Catholic Register and in Catholic World Report that have been somewhat critical, if not very critical, of the Holy Father, Pope Francis. And I would like to take this opportunity to publicly say, to differentiate myself from those who are now wondering, no, I have not suddenly moved into the radical traditionalist movement. I do not believe that Pope Francis is a heretic. He is the valid Pope. I think everything he's written in things like Amoris Laetitia and other places, if you have a mind to do it, can be interpreted in orthodox ways. My biggest problem is with, in a sense, what he's re-empowered in the church, what he has unleashed once again in the church.
Right.
That's a different conversation for a different day, but I wanted to get that out there. And people wondering, well, why with regard to your blog are you suddenly shifting gears and talking about this? Because at the end of the day, this revolution in moral theology, as I see it, that's going on, has a direct impact on my particular theological hobby horses that I'm most concerned with. Things like the universal call to holiness and the need for that universal call to holiness to be really ramped down on in the way that John Paul did. But once again, I'm just saying that to get that out there for my loyal viewers as to what's going on. In your case, though, Doctor, I would like to talk about, first off, Chapp, I would like to talk about Vatican II and where you place Francis in Vatican II, but that requires talking a little bit more about, as I like to do, Vatican II and the different schools and the hermeneutic of tradition that's going on here. So that chapter 1 of your book deals with St. Vincent of Lerins and his rules for how to discern proper doctrine development from improper. So maybe you can unpack that for my viewers.
Okay, so I like to start here with, John the 23rd's opening address at the Second Vatican Council, where he makes that distinction, really drawing on Saint Vincent of Lerins. So he makes the distinction. He says, "For the deposit of faith, the truths contained in our venerable doctrine are one thing, the fashion in which they are expressed," and then you have the subordinate clause, "but with the same meaning and the same judgment," is another thing. So that phrase, that subordinate clause, "with the same meaning and the same judgment," idem sensu, idemque sententia, that passage is actually referring back, or that subordinate clause is actually referring us back to the First Vatican Council, 1869, 1870, because the council there actually, in the fourth chapter, actually cites Vincent of Lerins in discussing precisely this question of doctrinal development.
Right.
And the important thing is that, well, several things. One is, the important thing is that there's the distinction between the propositional truths of faith and their expression. That distinction, the propositional truths of faith and their formulations, in reflecting on the sense in which a doctrine, which is already confirmed and defended, is more fully known and deeply understood. So that distinction is crucial, and it's crucial for Vincent. So Vatican I is referring us back actually to Vincent, to the 5th century monk, to his Commonitorium, where Vincent is asking the question, is there no progress in religion, he says. And then he makes a distinction between progress and change. And change is when one thing becomes something else. So, for instance, I often give the example. So in Mark 10, Jesus is asked about divorce, and he refers us back to the creation text of Genesis 1:27. God created man in his image, male and female, he created him. Therefore, Jesus says, and then refers us to Genesis 2:24, a man shall leave his mother and his father and cleave unto his wife. And the two, well, which two? Well, refers us back to Genesis 1:27, male and female, and the two shall become one flesh. So for Jesus, those texts are, those creation texts are about permanence. They're about two-ness, male and female two-ness, but they're also about sexual differentiation being a fundamental prerequisite for the two to become one flesh. So in my view, and I would refer here even to John Henry Newman, there's a conceptual dogmatic hardcore there.
Yes.
That is that has to be held onto, you see. So anybody who says, for instance, because you have people, sadly, even within the church, even cardinals and so on, who suggest that somehow same-sex quote unquote marriage is really just a development of marriage and all that. No, that can't be the case, because it doesn't keep the same meaning, if we go back to Vincent, nor is it making the same judgment of truth, because it has to be, Vincent says, within the proper limits, within the same dogma. So when Vincent then answers the question, of course there's progress, he says, but there isn't change. Therefore, let there be growth and abundant progress and understanding, he says, knowledge and wisdom in each and all, in individuals and in the whole church, at all times and in the progress of ages, but only within the proper limits, he says, within the same dogma, the same meaning, the same judgment, he says. Now, that distinction between the propositional truths of faith and their formulations conceptually, linguistically, and so on, to me, that's fundamental for actually giving a legitimate account of doctrinal development.
Right.
So what happens is that in my view, neo-traditionalists, what I call neo-traditionalists, you see, I think that they don't see that distinction. I don't think they accept that distinction. And so for them, to take an example, if you ask the question about ecumenism, they'll point us back to Pius XI's encyclical of 1928, Mortalium Animus, and they will take that as normative, you see. And they will say that text is actually normative, and Vatican II's Unitatis Redintegratio and John Paul's Ut Unum Sint actually contradicts that text. Now, in my view, and I try to do that here, and I do that in this article that I sent you that's coming out on Vincent of Lerins in a collection. Right. In my view, there's a way of, I would call it a historical hermeneutic, that you have to read Mortalium Animus in its context. And in its context, I would say everything that Mortalium Animus rejected about ecumenism, Vatican II still rejects. For instance, Mortalium Animus rejects, and Vatican II rejects, ecclesiological relativism,
right.
a multiple subsistence ecclesiology, as if there are many churches. It rejects the branch theory of Christianity. But the one thing that is important is that it seems to me that Pius never asked the question, well, what is ecumenism? At Vatican II, being prepared for by, Congar and Donnelly and many others, they asked the question, what is ecumenism? The council came to the conclusion, as Ratzinger put it, that the church found a way to reconcile a commitment to ecumenism with the first principles of Catholic ecclesiology. And of course, the first principle of Catholic ecclesiology is that the church that Christ founded subsists in its own right alone in the Catholic Church. Hence, there's no multiple subsistence ecclesiology. But it doesn't follow from that therefore outside the visible boundaries of the church, all you have is an ecclesial wasteland or emptiness. No.
Right.
That's one dilemma that's one conclusion that people draw wrongly. The other thing is when Lumen Gentium 8 says that there are elements of truth and sanctification outside the visible boundaries of the church, then people have drawn the conclusion that Vatican II affirmed an ecclesiological relativism or an ecclesial pluralism. That's also wrong, it seems to me. So I think there's a way, Father Monsignor Guarino and I've argued for that as well. That there's a way to see continuity there. There's definitely a certain development, but and even a certain alteration, because the church comes to embrace ecumenism, which Pius rejected. So underneath that, there is in fact, underneath that apparent, I would call it an apparent inconsistency between Mortalium Animus and Unitatis Redintegratio, there's a way of showing that it's not really inconsistent at all. New questions are being asked, and the answer that is given to embracing ecumenism is not inconsistent with the first principles of Catholic ecclesiology, which is that the church is the fully and rightly ordered expression of the body of Christ. And then one last thing. Okay, so I think the neo-traditionalist doesn't make the distinction between the propositional truths of faith and their expressions conceptually, linguistically, and he then seems to think that there's only one way to say this. There's only one way to say it.
Right.
However, and then there's what has come to be called the pastorality of doctrine approach. And the pastorality of doctrine approach collapses the distinction between the propositional truths of faith and their expression. And it treats the deposit of faith as a whole as something that needs to be recontextualized and reinterpreted over time. And so basically, I think they're historicists. They deny the enduring validity of truth. They interpret the law of evangelization that we find in Gaudium et Spes as if somehow that's what it's all about, just reinterpreting and recontextualizing.
Yes,
the deposit.
They would maybe be followers of sort of the school of George Lindbeck, who would say, that theology comes in paradigms, and then there's a paradigm shift. And it's not that what was before was wrong, is that we're now thinking in a completely different set of categories.
The interesting thing is that was before. It's possible to interpret I would say the first edition of Lindbeck's classic book on religion, but then he was corrected by Bruce Marshall, who later became Catholic, and Bruce Marshall helped Lindbeck to see that there's a distinction between truth and the conditions under which we come to know, between truth and justification. The question of justification has to do with what are the conditions under which I know that something is true, and the conditions that make something true. And Lindbeck at one point collapsed that, and so was talking about intrasystematic coherence, as if truth was just about the internal coherence of a belief system or a doctrinal system. And in the new edition that came out also years ago, Lindbeck says, no, I was wrong about that because I'm actually a realist. In fact, I'm a theistic realist about truth, he says. Justification is something different. But these people like Gallardus, and others, they've collapsed the distinction. They've collapsed the distinction. Where does Francis fit into this? I initially, in the first edition of my book, I tried to interpret Francis in a Linarian vein by reading him in a way where he seemed to be suggesting that he accepted the distinction between the propositional truths of faith and their expression. But over time, and there are three reasons why over time, I thought, no, it's not the case. If you want me to say something about why over time, because there are three things in Francis's position. For instance, he's skeptical about abstract truth, which means to me that he's skeptical about propositions. You know, he falls into that camp who says, well, faith is about a person, not an abstract truth, not a proposition.
Yeah. There's ideas and then there's reality. He said,
well, that's another aspect of it, of course, but that's right. And the ideas, if you ask, well, is the Nicene Creed that we confess every Sunday, is that just an idea? Is it telling us something true about God? But the first thing has to do with abstract truth, which then, because he rejects that or diminishes the significance of abstract truth, which in my view diminishes the significance of propositions, he then also diminishes the significance of the fides quae creditur, the content of faith, you see.
Yeah.
And then secondly, and this is always shocking to me, he rejects absolute truth. He rejects
maybe explain that a little bit more.
Well, so in my book, I have a section where I discuss his when he's having that exchange, which he should never have had, with Eugenio Scalfari, you know.
Oh, the atheist who just died, yes.
The atheist guy is actually saying to Francis, you know, I say one of his questions asks whether there is no absolute and therefore no absolute truth, but only a series of relative and subjective truth. Now, Francis goes on to say, I would not speak about absolute truths, he says, even for believers, in the sense that that absolute is that which is disconnected and bereft of all relationship. Truth is a relationship. Already here, I would say Francis confuses. I agree. The knowledge of truth is a relationship. It has to do with the conditions under which I come to grasp the truth of some proposition. That's a relationship, of course, but truth itself is not a relationship. And then he says, and this is always shocking to me, he says that we have to renounce the idea, and he says this in several places. To dialogue means to believe, Francis says, that the other has something worthwhile to say and to entertain his or her point of view and perspective. Engaging in dialogue does not mean renouncing our own ideas and traditions, but the renouncing of the claim that they alone are valid or absolute. So if a truth is if a truth is absolute, that means that the proposition that's asserted there is true independently of whether anyone affirms it.
Let me play devil's advocate here just a little bit.
Sure.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just anticipating
absolutely
objections people might have. People might say, and I've heard people say it, Pope Francis is not a deep or profoundly systematic intellectual academic thinker, say, the way a John Paul or a Benedict were. Right. And that's no slight against him. It's just not his forte, not his gift. Therefore, he has an imprecision, perhaps, in how he expresses himself sometimes, even in writing, even though he has ghostwriters, as all popes do. Okay? So maybe, just maybe, when he says that he would not hold to absolute truth, maybe what he's actually thinking of and critiquing here is some sort of Enlightenment-based notion of a raw and pure Archimedean objectivity, a fact-value distinction, in other words, a rationalistic understanding of what propositions mean in a Christian context. What would you say to that objection to what you're saying?
All right. I would say that you don't have to be a philosopher or have taken classes in epistemology or have written a doctoral thesis on it to know that if P is true, then not P must be false. And hence anyone who holds not P must be wrong. So,
and that maybe you shouldn't say such things to an atheist journalist who doesn't even take notes.
Who doesn't even take notes. No, it seems to me that
Yeah.
How does one say this? But I ask, what does Francis mean when urging us to renounce the claim that the central truth claims of Christianity are alone valid or absolute? Or is the truth is asserting that Jesus Christ is the incarnate Word of God? Is asserting the claim that he died for our sins, that he rose from the dead? Are those truths not valid?
Or that salvation comes squarely and only through Christ?
Exactly. Are those truths not valid? Are they not absolutely true? Regardless of whether anyone... Remember, you have to distinguish between the conditions under which I come to know that something is true. Of course, that involves a relationship. Of course, that's, contextual, historical, etc. But what makes it true that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us? Isn't that an absolute truth? I don't have to be a philosopher or have taken courses in epistemology or anything like that to say the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Period.
Yeah.
So as it stands, I say this claim is confusing. If P is true, then not P must be false, and hence anyone who holds not P must be wrong. We live in a culture where people claim that there are no true propositions. Yet if there are no true propositions, there are no false ones either. There are just differences and no one is wrong. This is relativism about truth. Now, of course, Francis would deny that he's a relativist about truth, but with the way that he expresses himself is confusing, and it suggests when you say, when he says, and he says this in many places, yes, engaging in dialogue does not mean renouncing our own ideas and traditions. Of course not. He doesn't think you as a Christian, when you engage in interreligious dialogue, that you're renouncing your own ideas. I have a chapter on religious dialogue in my book, but his interreligious dialogue is not a truth-oriented practice.
Which absolutely brings home, when he first started talking about how opposed he was to proselytizing, I reacted like a lot of theologians did. Well, yeah, proselytizing is sort of evangelizing, but in a very bad way. There is a distinction between evangelizing and proselytizing. So it was like water off a duck's back. I didn't care. I thought, okay, I know what he means. But it turns out, actually, that I don't think he means the bad kind of proselytizing. I think that in a lot of ways he meant we shouldn't seek to convert people.
I think you're right. I've argued that in my the Catholic World Report 2-part article I wrote on trying to understand, No, I think he doesn't. And in fact, because there's a place right at the beginning on What's the Nature of Faith where I say, that he thinks that witness is enough, he says. And then I quote, it's, Paul VI in Evangelii Nuntiandi, where he says, no, witness is not enough. It's insufficient. At some point, you have to verbally.
Yes.
You have to say.
Yes.
You have to provide you have to actually ask people. It seems to me that at some point you have to tell people why, and that means justifying your position. Why are you not a Buddhist?
Right.
Why are you not a Muslim? Why are you not even a Jew? You see, so he's not against people telling in a discussion, coming to that discussion with the variety of positions and all that. But what he is against, and as I said, he says this many times, you have to renounce the claim that your own views are valid or absolute. And to me, that means that in interreligious dialogue, as I say, unlike John Paul and unlike Benedict, his understanding of interreligious dialogue is not a truth-oriented practice. It's not that
It brings up the question, and I agree with you, that it just doesn't seem truth-based. It seems to be more based on emotions or something, or what your cultural traditions are. And that what we have are sort of rival or differing cultural horizons, which include religion, sort of interfacing with each other. And if somebody becomes interested in Christianity via that interface and they want to join, okay, great, come on in. But there's not going to be any sort of active Christian pursuit of taking the spoils of Egypt and making them our own.
No, nothing like that. Nothing like, I mean, he seems to be against apologetics. Not always. but he sounds as if he's against apologetics. If you're trying to persuade someone, anyway, you were gonna ask something.
It was about his concept of dialogue, and what he actually means by it, because I'm often puzzled by the fact. I think he's actually, I mean, he is the Holy Father. I don't like going on and criticizing him.
No, I understand.
I have lately, but it just seems to me he's right. We need to have dialogue. In the sense of a true exchange of ideas and so
Absolutely.
on. But he seems singularly not wanting to have dialogue with a huge part of the church. He says he wants dialogue. He says he wants synodality, but then he rules via motu proprio, and diktat. And he just recently told the Vatican told the bishop in Savannah, you have to end the Latin Mass within a year. Wait a minute. What if what happened to synodality? What happened to the right of a bishop to rule the liturgical right in his own diocese and so on? What about dialoguing with the periphery that is the traditionalists?
He's always been inconsistent on that, it seems to me. One other thing, and that's the this whole, if Gaudium, not what is it, Evangelii Gaudium. There are a lot of good things in Evangelii Gaudium.
Yeah,
absolutely. But in my view, some of those first principles he articulates there. One of them, of course, has to do with this business about reality is greater than ideas, And right. Initially, of course, I took that to mean, and I acknowledge that I was completely wrong about that. Obviously, you can know something truly without knowing it exhaustively. And so reality, of course, you deepen your understanding of reality, of people, et cetera, et cetera. But he doesn't mean that. I say in my book, if I understand them correctly, there are three reasons for this priority. First, Francis wants to avoid the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is the error of treating an abstract truth, idea, doctrinal formulation as if it were the real concrete thing. Rather, he emphasizes there exists a constant tension between ideas and realities. Realities simply are, whereas ideas are worked out. But then the problem is, then I say, look, this first point raises one question in particular that Francis does not address, but which is crucial to understanding the true status of doctrinal propositions or doctrinal formulations. Are the truths of faith expressed in the creedal statements of Nicaea and Chalcedon, more particularly orthodoxy, are they just ideas, mere theory? Because that's how we talk sometimes. Mere theory, mere thoughts, or mere sets of words altogether separate from God? Or do they convey or grasp divine reality itself, the truth about that reality, fulfilling the truth-attaining capacity of the human mind to lay hold of divine truth? I think his approach tends to minimize the significance of doctrines, the significance of doctrinal formulations. So I would locate Francis not with respect to the Lerenian view of Vatican II, and certainly not with respect to the Neo-traditionalist view, but he's somewhere in that pastorality of doctrine approach where it's all about recontextualizing and reinterpreting the deposit of faith. Now, of course, he's always fond of citing Vincent of Lerins, but what he never cites in Vincent is that keeping the same meaning and the same judgment. He never cites that. He never cites that passage.
Yeah.
And that to me is a fundamental mistake, and that's why he's not really interested in the meaning and truth of dogma and when you're the hermeneutics of how you deal with these things. How do you deal with Mortalium Animus of 1928 and Vatican II?
I want to come back to that in a minute, but I want to stay on I want to, in other words, the hermeneutics of continuity, reform, rupture. I want to talk about that in a minute because I have some questions based on Guarino's book. But I want to come back to Francis with regard to in my recent articles about him. I use the word proportionalism in describing certain things. And a lot of people came after me and misinterpreted what I was saying. You're calling Pope Francis a proportionalist. You're saying Amoris Laetitia espouses proportionalism. And I want to be very clear. No, I did not say that. And I was very careful not to say that he is a proportionalist. In some ways, to use the word proportionalism is a bit anachronistic because very few people even use that word anymore. Even moral theologians who actually are some version of it don't use that word anymore. So I was just sort of using proportionalism as a kind of shorthand. It's a genus under which there are various species.
Right.
And one of those species is kind of what you're describing here, which is this very pastoral approach. And now we use words like accompaniment, discernment, complex life circumstances, ideas versus reality. To me, these are all simply sort of very vague buzzwords that are pointing to a species of a kind of situational ethics approach to things. And so, yeah, I'm not calling the Pope a proportionist. I just think that he has dangerously re-empowered those in the church who do think along those lines. Look at the purge at the Academy for Life.
Oh,
look at the purge for the
absolutely.
JP2 Institute in Rome. Look at this new document that apparently the Academy for Life is coming out with that's going to call into question, supposedly, Humanae Vitae and so on. These are all dog whistles to me.
Well, of course, and part of that is what you I think in your response to we didn't want to talk about him, Pedro's book.
Yeah.
The Pope doesn't distinguish between negative precepts, which are more moral absolutes, and the positive precepts, which have presumptive validity, but there are going to be certain circumstances under which, if you have moral reasons to where that precept won't be applicable. He doesn't make a distinction. I think his understanding of moral precepts is simply that they all have presumptive validity, and so I think he thinks they're all positive precepts as opposed to the negative precepts.
Well, just so people don't get lost here, the non-expert in our conversation, a negative moral precept is a precept that applies always and everywhere.
Always and everywhere. It's
like you don't kill the innocent and so on.
Exactly. It's an exceptionalist moral norm. Whereas a positive precept is not an exceptionalist moral norm. It has presumptive validity. You begin with the presumption that the precept is valid, like if you take Thomas's example about stealing. Or if you take the example, you going out with a friend to a bachelor party, and he gives you his keys to his car, and the assumption is that these are his keys, and so you'll
give them back.
You give him back, but the fact is he gets inebriated, and you say, no, I'm not going to give you your keys back because you're drunk and you're going to get into an accident and perhaps kill yourself or kill somebody else. Okay. The presumption is, of course, that moral precept is valid, but under those circumstances, maybe that precept is not applicable. But a negative moral precept is universally valid. It's an exceptionalist moral precept. There are no exceptions to it. That you shouldn't commit adultery is an exceptionalist moral precept. I don't think the Pope. Even though he tells us in various places that his ethics is Thomistic and so on, I don't think his ethics is Thomistic precisely because he fails to make that distinction. And you have people who've tried to defend the Pope there, but the mere fact that the Pope says that we have to recognize the value of certain precepts doesn't mean, yes, even if it's a positive precept, you have to recognize the value of that positive precept, but that doesn't make it exceptional, an exceptionalist moral norm. I think the Pope, in my view, he's trying to carve out a place for exceptions such that a person can actually, I know we weren't going to talk about this, such that a person can actually divorce and civilly remarried person can actually receive communion.
Yeah.
But that's another. That's another.
That's a different conversation. I mean, like I've said, in some ways, I think his position is a conclusion in search of an argument. So he starts with the pastorally, and it's a pastorally problematic situation.
Of course, of course,
has to have to confront all the time, and I feel for that because full disclosure, sure. I'm divorced, remarried, and annulled, and right. I have an annulment, so I can appreciate.
And so am I. So am I.
Yeah, the trauma of that. I don't want to be a hypocrite here.
No, of course
not. But the fact is that adultery is an exceptionalist moral norm, and the church teaches
that's exactly
that invalid second marriages that are not sacramental or following the words of our Lord are adultery, and so. But I think the Pope's thinking, well, yeah, but not like real adultery, right? It's a different kind. It's got stability and kids, and so it's a different kind of adultery that maybe is not really so bad. But anyway, we don't want to get
another conversation.
But, that's a different conversation for a different day. But the point, though, is that he doesn't interpret Aquinas properly, and he does not. In my article, I gave a shout out to your book because I relied heavily on that because I think you're absolutely right that he misreads Aquinas in this regard. So it goes back to then your categories of Vatican II, which is really what I kind of want to return to here. So you're talking about the second category, I think, which is the pastoral approach to doctrinal proposition.
Which I think is historicist. I think it denies the enduring validity of propositional truth. It denies the enduring validity of truth and fails to then, it conflates. It conflates everything into the expression of truth. And so there's no distinction between the propositional truths of faith and their linguistic and conceptual expression. So there's the whole Lerenian, the alternative expression has to keep the same meaning and the same judgment. You don't keep the same meaning and the same judgment if a change is involved there. Vincent says it has to be within the boundaries, within the limits of the dogma. I think that I think that the Pope doesn't. Rejects that because he's skeptical about abstract truth. That also is connected, as I said, with his diminishing the significance of the fides quae creditur, the content of faith, that the content of faith is revealed, and that's connected also with his rejection of absolute truth, that you can claim that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. See, he's not a realist in the sense that the assertion, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, that proposition is true if and only if what that proposition asserts is in fact the case about objective reality.
Yeah.
Now, he doesn't bring him, I don't know why he can't say that. Because truth of its very nature is exclusionary. I say to my students, if the truth of the incarnation, if that's absolutely true, if it's true to reality, that excludes a state of affairs in which Islam is true. Because Islam denies the incarnation. It excludes a state of affairs if there's St. Paul saying this is a trustworthy saying that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. If Christ is the full and sufficient cause of our salvation, if that's true in a realist sense, then it seems to me it excludes a state of affairs in which that's denied. That's what makes it an absolute truth. How can we say that it's not, that it itself is not alone valid or absolute? That's either he's confused, or I can't believe that he's really denying that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us.
I don't think he is.
I don't think he is. But then he's saying things that anyone who asks the question, well, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, isn't that true to reality? Doesn't that exclude a state of affairs in which that truth is denied? Doesn't that make that truth valid in itself, an absolute truth? It just seems to me that all of those things, and then the other thing about ideas are greater than reality, then it seems to me, again, you have a diminishing of the significance of creeds and confessions and just Christian orthodoxy. Now,
Yeah.
I always add here, of course, you can know something truly without knowing it absolutely. And so you can continue to deepen your understanding of the truth that you grasp, such as the truth of the incarnation. I mean, or the Trinity. People, theologians have written about that for almost 2,000 years. But there has to be a continuity. However I deepen my understanding of those truths has to be consistent with what we already know to be the case.
And that's because not only is truth exclusionary, what it excludes are propositions are the diametrically opposite to it.
Falsehood.
But it's also, for that very reason, radically inclusionary as an explanatory framework of reality that sort of gobbles up ever more sort of data points in its favor as it deepens and deepens and deepens its understanding.
Exactly. But I don't know. Well, part of it is, of course, that the people that you surround yourself with, if they don't understand that. See, here's where people say, you asked me earlier, when people say, well, the Pope's not a philosopher, blah, blah, blah. Well, then surround yourself. He surrounded himself. He had Cardinal Muller. Yeah. And he fired Cardinal Muller.
Yes.
And Cardinal Muller, of course, is a sharp man. He's an intellectual. Yeah. He's a philosophical theologian, et cetera, et cetera. So if you surround yourself with people who are going to say to you, okay, no, we can't say that because it implies this.
Right.
But he got rid of those people.
People wonder, well, why all of a sudden, Larry, Mr. Chapp, Dr. Chapp, various names, I can't mention here. Why all of a sudden, have you decided to focus on this? Because as I look at the Episcopal appointments that Pope Francis has made, giving Bishop McElroy a red hat on top of Supich and Tobin and so on, and Supich is just a thug of the First Order. And these are the men that you have elevated, and therefore, by definition, that you, in a sense, are surrounding yourself with. I mean, Supich is now on 3 Vatican dicasteries, one of which is on liturgy and so on. So, I don't want to be overly harsh towards the Holy Father, but you got to call it like you see it. At some point, you purge the Academy for Life and replace them with progressive, proportionalist type thinkers. You purge the John Paul II Institute of JP2 types and replace them with proportionalist type thinkers. You elevate people like Supich and Tobin and Farrell and McElroy, and you give photo ops to James Martin. You send letters to you send letters of support to Sister Gramick of the New Ways Ministry and saying, yeah, you go, girl. And after a while, you step back and say, what is going on? It is, in some ways, people like you and I are in a bad spot because 98% of what Pope Francis writes is beautiful, it's orthodox, it's wonderful, and, it gives those who support him kind of cover. And it makes people like you and I look like, well, mean-spirited, cranky, old-line conservatives who just can't deal with a little change or whatever. No, it's not that. I've spent the better part of 9 years defending this Pope, okay? And at some point, you simply have to step back and say, there's a crisis of truth here.
Absolutely.
There is, as you have so well put it, there's a crisis of truth here. There's a crisis of X is X and not Y. And you cannot affirm both at the same time.
That's
and
what Ralph Martin argued in his book, his recent book on the. I think.
Yeah, I don't. I like his book. I didn't like the chapter on Balthasar and von Speyer, but we won't go into that.
No, let's not go into Balthasar. But I think on the whole, he has a grasp of what the crisis is.
He does. I agreed with everything else in the book. I just didn't like that chapter.
No, I understand.
Well, not just that chapter, just the very beginning of that chapter. But anyway, because he dealt with other things in that chapter besides Balthasar. But anyway, forget Ralph. Hello, Ralph, out there listening. And Ralph taught at your seminary, so you're probably good friends.
He's the director of the program, New Evangelization. He's still there.
Yeah, well, yeah,
but
good.
But I think, just to reiterate, I mean, I think it's very important because there are people now who are taking distance from Vatican II documents. I think the Vatican II documents, what they assert is utterly beautiful, utterly important for the Church. Now, of course, there are things that the Vatican II documents like on the question of religious freedom. The Neo-traditionalist sides with, with Archbishop Lefebvre that somehow the Declaration on Religious Liberty. Remember, Lefebvre said in his book, that religious freedom. I don't even know how he said that since he actually signed the document. But after he signed it, he thought that affirming religious liberty actually dethrones the lordship of Christ. That was the title of his book.
Yeah.
So I mean, again, those kind of things are
okay. But let's focus on that for a second. As I said before, I wanted to come back to this question of the Hermeneutics of Vatican II and Monsignor Guarino's book.
Right.
Which I highly recommend to my viewers. I've blogged on it before, The Disputed Teachings of Vatican II.
Yeah, it's a great book. I wrote a review of it for...
and Guarino, though, let's take the issue of religious freedom. He would say Dignitatis Humanae is certainly appealing to deep elements of the tradition. It simply is not innovating here. It's not simply accommodating itself to modern political liberalism.
No.
It is appealing, as Cardinal Ratzinger Benedict said, it's appealing to the notion that truth should not be coerced. And this is a deeply embedded part of the tradition. However, Monsignor Guarino goes on to point out that this does involve a little bit of a rupture, discontinuity with documents like Mirari Vos, where the Pope not only says, is religious freedom something that can lead to religious relativism and indifference? Yes. For that reason, he therefore calls the whole idea absurd and erroneous in Mirari Vos. The whole notion of religious freedom and its root is absurd and erroneous. It's hard not to see, in some sense, a certain discontinuity between Vatican
there is, but that's where I say you have to apply a historical hermeneutic.
Right.
So you first have to consider the historical context in which the document originated, particularly if its statements are polemical and antithetical. So I think the Pope is reacting to the idea that religious liberty, that religion is subjective, that it's not connected to any kind of rationality, certainly not connected to truth, to reality. And it's so if you put it back in its historical context, then it seems to me you can say that all truth formulated for polemical reasons is partial, albeit true. This means that what these documents fail to say is not necessarily denied, I say. Furthermore, what they did say is true, albeit said insufficiently and imperfectly, less than balanced or comprehensive. I mean, you can say that about any you can say that about documents from the Council of Trent. We can't possibly think that Trent said everything that there is to say about the sacraments.
Right. Which only goes to remind everyone that the charism of ecclesial infallibility is a negative charism. It is not the positive charism of inspiration as with Scripture.
No, that's right.
It's a negative charism that simply says the Holy Spirit guarantees the Church will not fall into egregious error in a matter central to faith and morals. It doesn't guarantee, and this goes back to your distinction, it doesn't guarantee that the particular linguistic expression and the culturally conditioned expression with which the Church expresses some of these truths is always and everywhere going to stay in place, that it might need correction.
And as if what was said there is everything we need to say now. There's nothing more that needs to be said. No.
Right.
What is said must be supplemented and hence interpreted with respect. And then I quote Congar from his book, True and False Reform of the Church, where he says, it must be hence interpreted with respect to the full doctrine and full life of the Church. He adds, ambivalence, if there is any, will be resolved positively in the direction of orthodoxy, says Congar. There's a second hermeneutical principle here, the distinction between the propositional truths of faith and their reformulation or restatement. It seems to me that we can deepen our understanding of these truths. We can have a deepening in formulation and conceptuality, but of course, it has to be consistent with what we already affirm to be the case. Now, it's clear that even Leo the 13th and the denial from Gregory about religious freedom, all that, if you put it back in its historical context and you ask, well, how did they understand religious freedom? Well, then we can come away saying that everything that they rejected about religious freedom, Vatican II still rejects. Vatican II doesn't think the epistemology, as it were, of Dignitatis Humanae is not a subjectivistic one. It distinguishes between the conditions under which I come to grasp that something is true and what makes it true. It distinguishes between truth and justification. It's not as if it's somehow suggesting that you're free to embrace whatever you want, and that somehow. Remember, it says there, error has no rights. It says, so it rejects indifferentism. If that's according to, in fact, in Mirari Vost, the Pope said that religious liberty entailed indifferentism. He says in paragraph 13. According to Gregory XVI, this perverse opinion is spread on all sides by the fraud of the wicked who claim that it is possible to obtain the eternal salvation of the soul by the profession of any kind of religion, as long as morality is maintained. Surely, in so clear a matter, you will drive this deadly error from the people committed to your care with the admonition of the apostles that there is one God, one faith, one baptism. So, in other words, indifferentism supports religious relativism. All religions are equally vehicles of salvation, equally true. Relativism about truth, a subjectivist religious epistemology, and last but not least, the privatization of Christianity. Well, it seems to me all of that Mirari Voss rejected is rejected by Dignitatis Humanae.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Dignitatis Humanae got interpreted through the lens of the United States and people like John Courtney Murray to mean that it was a blessing of it was the church blessing the political arrangement of modern political liberalism, separation of church and state, and the kind of religious indifferentism. David L. Schindler, who Communio,
sure,
he's been on this now for decades. About that this is not what Dignitatis Humanae was doing, and it was not rejecting the notion of that religious indifferentism tied to a particular view of freedom as simply absence of coercion is deeply problematic from a Christian point of view. So in other words, one can envision, in other words, a political and social order in which the government does grant broad religious freedom rights because the faith should not be coerced, while at the same time acknowledging the truth of the Catholic faith. At the same time, acknowledging the truth of, or more generally, the Christian faith, in ways that aren't necessarily coercive of non-Christians, and that way just through the pedagogy of that acknowledgement, sort of avoid, that kind of indifferentism. But anyway, that's a different topic.
That's a different. I would say that here I say Gregory XVI's reaction to the error of religious and doctrinal indifferentism and all its entailments is indeed characterized by one-sidedness, insofar as he did not consider that there were elements of truth in the view that he was condemning. Vatican II's Dignitatis Humanae did not suffer from that one-sidedness. We live in a fierce society that is pluralistic. In that society, one is free to hold religious or irreligious views. The exercise of that freedom does not entail that I am rationally justified in holding those views, nor that those views that I hold are objectively true. By the terms of our free and open society, however, there exists in principle a public forum, which of course has been squashed, a public forum in which I am at liberty to persuade that person that he is not justified in holding his views, that they're not true, that he's not justified, that it's not reasonable. And here, in fact, Dignitatis Humanae specifies the intellectual and moral conditions under which I may discover the truth and be justified in holding something to be true. Now, I think you're right. Dignitatis Humanae has been totally, well, in a way like Unitatis Redintegratio, has been totally misinterpreted. I remember giving lectures in South Africa, at Catholic institutions, and they all seem to accept the idea that Lumen Gentium 8 was and the ecclesiology of Vatican II was actually supporting a multiple subsistence ecclesiology and ecclesiological relativism, and so they read Lumen Gentium through those eyes. Of course, they then read the document on the church, Christ, and non-Christian religion.
Yes.
They read it through the lens of religious pluralism.
The pluralism school of world religions.
All of that. So
one absolute, many paths. All
of that. Which is not what the council taught. So the council has been received wrongly. I don't think. See, just one last thing here. It seems to me you can't. No document is going to be perfect. It's going to be true. What it asserts is true, but that doesn't mean that now it has said everything that needs to be said about a particular topic. And so it doesn't. Dignitatis Humani. It doesn't work out or Unitatis Redintegratio. It doesn't work out the relationship, the continuity between previous, Mortalium Animus or Mirari Vos, and it doesn't work that out. So that's entrusted to us, the minds, those that are faithful to the teachings of the Church, to try to work out this without falling into the kind of neo-traditionalism that says, no, what's normative is really Mortalium Animus, 1928.
And one has to be sophisticated about these things. You can't just cherry pick papal documents and say, hey, look, one pope one time said this, and therefore that constitutes an infallible statement. Well, that's a kind of oracular view of the papacy.
No, that's right.
The question was Mirari Vos, an infallible document? No, it was not. Was it articulating an infallible teaching of the Church that there should not be religious freedom at any time for anyone? No, that's not at all.
Indifferentism or religious subjectivism or the privatization of Christianity, none of that is entailed by the Declaration on Religious Liberty.
But let me push back though a little bit. There is a sense in which, obviously, Dignitatis Humanae hit like a bombshell to people like Lefebvre and so forth, because post-Trent maybe even post-Florence even or something like that, there did emerge in the Catholic Church, even in its upper corridors of power, a strikingly narrow vision of salvation.
Right.
I mean, you can go to the Council of Florence.
Right.
There is no salvation outside of the visible church. You have to submit to the Roman pontiff or you will not have salvation.
Right.
This is why religious freedom is wrong. It's why it's okay to burn heretics at the stake for their own good, as we see in Exsurge Domine, where the Pope condemns the Lutheran idea that it's wrong to burn heretics at the stake. So at some point, I do think it's not altogether improper to say that the Church has sometimes, through overemphasis, an atrophy of one aspect and a hypertrophy of another, in some sense, engaged in the teaching of error.
Right.
Now that's
at the very least, engaged in certain teaching. Well, if we're talking about teaching that's not, that distinction between primary and secondary objects of infallibility, and we come to third level teaching.
That's what I'm getting at. Yes.
Yeah. So that teaching, of course, is not infallible. It doesn't have infallibility. Simply means that the Church ascribes the highest degree of certainty to this proposition. So if it's a non-infallible teaching, I don't think there's anything wrong, misleading to say that the Church was actually incorrect about this.
Right. And that's why a knowledge of history and the development of doctrine is indispensable, and sometimes social media and the era of social media with memes and things like that can
Now,
be
of course, the church,
so misleading.
There are certain teachings that are infallible, primary, secondary objects of infallibility. I always say to my students, I say that there will never be a time that the church teaches that 2 men or 2 women can be married.
Right, exactly.
It's infallible teaching, and what makes it infallible? The church doesn't make it. The church doesn't make it true. It's important to distinguish between a teaching, infallibility, and truth, because infallibility has to do with ascribing the highest degree of certainty to a proposition that the church already knows to be true. So the notion that the two shall become one flesh, man and woman, and that sexual differentiation is a fundamental prerequisite for that union, that's a truth about reality.
An ontological truth.
It is an ontological, exactly. It's and so if it's true, that means it's always true. It's a universally valid truth. There's no way that the church can actually then come to teach its opposite. Now, of course, if you ascribe to, where the deposit of faith as a whole may be reinterpreted, recontextualized, and so on, then of course, you're going to be open, because you deny the enduring validity of truth. There's no conceptual, dogmatic conceptual hardcore there. There are no propositions that are true to reality. You don't even think. I think that view also denies. I argue that in a book of mine in Revelation, History, and Truth, in the 2nd chapter on the nature of revelation, the rejection of propositional truth, and hence the rejection of propositional revelation, that there's revealed truth. All of that, it seems to me, is a part of the historic teaching of the church. Unfortunately, that's minimized now. Hence, doctrine is minimized. Hence, the content of faith is minimized, and all of that we've been talking about. So it seems to me that initially I feel like I was led down. Well, I went the wrong way in reading Francis, because I was trying to put him in the Lerinian context.
Right, I was too.
Right, but I don't think that that's the case. Father Guarino, Monsignor Guarino, is now writing an article about that. Because initially he wrote an article when Francis was made Pope. I think in 2014 he wrote an article on the First Things website, arguing that really here Francis is just like Vincent of Lerins, you see, because you get all these passages even in that book, where that first book of interpretations that he did with the Jesuits and all that, and he appeals to Vincent, and he says development is organic and blah blah blah, but at the end of the day, he belongs. It seems he's certainly not a neo-traditionalist. He belongs in that middle category in some kind of way, because it's all about, the law of evangelization. Remember, I said from Vatican, from the Pastoral Constitution on the Church and Modern World, it's about recontextualizing and reinterpreting the gospel, the substance, the deposit of faith. But there's no discussion there about doctrinal propositions. And he's so concerned with being immobilist and being holding on to these things and thinking that you know everything and blah blah blah, that you at the end of the day
this puts your finger on something I think that's important, which is, Vatican II famously asked us to read the signs of the times. And it seems to me that one of the greatest deficiencies of the Francis papacy is that he actually has misdiagnosed the signs of the times.
Mm-hmm.
That pastorally, he still thinks that the church that exists in reality, since that's something he seems to champion, reality over ideas.
Reality, right.
The church that exists in reality is a church of rigid, pharisaical, right-wing, finger-wagging, sort
Right,
of
right,
scarlet letter
right.
types, and sometimes when I read these scolds that come from him, and I'm saying to myself, where is this
Where
church
are
he is
they? Where
talking?
are they? I don't see them. So
No,
he's always about that side, the negative, the rigorous, all that,
yeah.
the fundamentalist in that sense. But what about the antinomian? What
Yeah,
about the person who diminishes the significance of universally valid moral propositions?
yeah. The average Catholic parish in Western culture is populated by moral relativists, doctrinal subjectivists,
It's true.
uh,
It's absolutely true.
this very latitudinarian expression of what it means to be anything, and that's the pastoral reality on the ground. It's not that our churches are filled with these church lady types out there, finger
No,
wagging at people,
I
and yet
know.
that
That's
seems
his
to be
mindset.
animating. It's surprising, and so I say, well, is that because he's from Argentina? Is that the way the church is in Latin America? No, I've been in Latin America. I know, well, you're Latin,
Right,
that's your heritage.
right,
I mean,
right, right.
this is not the church in Latin America anymore. In fact, we're hemorrhaging Catholics to the Pentecostals in
Right,
Latin
right,
America,
right.
and not because we're overly rigorous or Pharisaic. So this is just a part of me just not understand. To me, I've often said Pope Francis is an enigma, uh, because he doesn't
Right.
seem to me just to be a straight up old fashioned liberal. I mean, he hasn't given them
No,
women priests, married
no,
priests,
no, no,
and
no.
any of that
Thankfully.
stuff, you
Right.
know. So he's not just an old fashioned liberal like that, but he's certainly not a traditionalist. I had
No,
harbored hopes early on that maybe because he read Guardini and he loved Guardini, I had hopes, well, maybe he's a communio, Res Source Mont guy like
no,
me,
no,
and no,
no,
he's not that.
no.
So where at the end of the day would you put him?
Well, I'm putting him in that second camp.
Yeah, the second cap you talked about. Yeah,
It's about as I said, the law of evangelization, which is about the reinterpretation and recontextualization of the deposit of faith of the gospel, and then of course, for instance, in ecumenism, he always gives the impression that somehow ecumenism is about generating unity out of ecclesial diversity. He's not going to begin
yeah,
with the notion, which is, it seems to me, what Vatican II teaches, that Catholic ecumenism begins with the assertion that there is one church. And so the question, which is the Catholic Church, and then the question becomes, how do we understand ecclesial unity and diversity within the one church? So you
yeah,
get to, so I mean, I think it's wrong-headed about how he has ecumenical conversations. I think it's also wrong-headed about the way he understands interreligious dialogue, because it's not truth-oriented, it's not truth-grounded. And that, again, has to do with the whole business about denying absolute truth. So this
yeah.
just leaves people confused
Yeah, especially in the moral realm.
in the moral realm.
I'm growing very impatient now with those who defend him, and people have noted my growing impatience, his moral thinking, on the
Right.
grounds that all he's doing is this Lerinian development of the
No,
concept
that's not
of
true.
subjective, invincible ignorance, the lessening of culpability through mitigating circumstances. Every single time I debate one of the defenders of Amoris Laetitia, chapter 8, they always say, "Oh, that's all he's doing." Oh, come
No,
on.
no,
But
that's
this
not
is
true.
why it's so important. This conference that took place at the Gregorian in May, that basically said point blank, Amoris Laetitia is reversing Veritatis Splendor on some very important and key
Well, and
points.
didn't it say that Veritatis Splendor, we have
Tied
to
the knots.
untie the knot?
Yeah. And
Well, and
what
that has to do with moral absolutes.
Yeah, because John Paul taught apparently this innovative idea of intrinsically evil actions that tied the church into knots, and Amoris Laetitia is untying it. Now, that was just one guy, Father Martinez, but there were others who echoed
Yes,
very, very similar thoughts. Then,
yes,
as I noted in my article, there's people that the Pope has hired to run the Academy for Life, work for the Academy for Life, who have said, John Paul was all about absolutes and commandments, but this Pope is about circumstances and so on. So and not about commandments. So I'm sorry that the defense that all this Pope is talking about in Amoris is simply mitigating circumstances, the invincible ignorance. You cannot use that narrative any longer. Please stop
it. And then he doesn't even give an account when people, like, for instance, is the person who, like one of the things the Pope says, the person who doesn't understand or doesn't agree with the moral rule or the moral principle. I don't see how that is a mitigating circumstance. If he doesn't understand it, maybe that's. Don't you want to challenge him? Why do you assume that he actually has a correct understanding of it? No, I think the whole notion of mitigating circumstances is in a way overused. I also think that I was trying to say earlier that the whole business about the law of gradualness and the gradualness of the law is misunderstood, even by that the fellow Pedro, because the gradualness, yes, the law of gradualness. I don't know of anybody that denies the law of gradualness.
Nobody denies that.
Nobody denies that.
You walk people slowly along the pastoral way.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean that the choices that they make are going to be morally justified. That doesn't mean that you don't have to go to confession and remember, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us.
To use scholastic language, what it means is your circumstances do not change the species of the moral object.
That's right. And yes, so you can distinguish between objective and subjective morality, but the fact is, part of this has to do with the way that what is Francis actually saying in paragraph 303? Is he when he says that you're doing you're giving your most honest, your most generous response in that situation?
Yeah, and God accepts that,
and that God accepts that. It seems to me, since that paragraph begins with situations where what you're doing is actually inconsistent with the objective demands of the moral law, and it concludes with that as well. It seems to me it cannot have anything to do with what my colleague and others have including this Pedro Gabriel, that somehow this has to do with the fact that you're making a choice moving in the right direction.
That's right. Yeah, Bob Fastigi, who we both admire, says that we have to read 303 in the light of 305. Paragraph 305 basically is saying that, no, we're not saying that the moral object changes. We're saying that God just recognizes that's the best you can do. And so he's kind of saying, attaboy, yeah, come on, And
that's where if you will, that's where, in a sense, whether one calls it proportionalism or not, the Pope is then arguing that's the best that you can do in those circumstances, even though we recognize that the objective moral norm, you're not reaching there, you're not attaining that. But
so it's got nothing to do with invincible ignorance, is the point.
No. At that point, it doesn't have to do with invincible ignorance.
You're acknowledging the validity of the moral norm.
That's right.
Yet what you're saying is, I can't do it.
I can't do it.
Grace is not sufficient. I'm not up to the sacrifice required to live up to that moral norm. This is the best I can do, God. And then the Pope says in 303, well, you can have a secure and quiet conscience.
That what you're doing, as he says, is in fact the will of God for you at this time. Do you know, so the gradualness of the law, this is what Pedro Gabriel doesn't understand. Yeah. The gradualness of the law, John Paul II identifies that very clearly in Familiaris Consortio, that the gradualness of the law has to do with situation and person-specific moral precepts that are specific to that situation, where you acknowledge that you can't attain at this time, the full reality of the moral law, and so you're going to be justified in that circumstance. And I remember, if that's not the case, if that's not what the Pope meant, why didn't he correct Cardinal Supage, who says where he's discussing, homosexuals, cohabiting homosexual couples, and whether they should receive communion, and he says explicitly, you have to deal with people where they are. And if that's the best that they can do in their circumstances, even though their circumstances and the choices that they're making are far away from the objective moral norm, well, they're going to be justified in doing that if that's the best that they can do. And so it seems to me, despite Francis's disclaimers that he doesn't accept the gradualness of the law, he does insert a certain situation, ethics there, where the person is going to be justified in doing this.
And let's face it, is it not true? And I've said this elsewhere with regard to straight up proportionalism, or what species of sub-proportionalism this is. Is this not true that it really, at the end of the day, is all about sex and sexuality? Nobody, like you just, the quote from Supich about, that's the best they can do. Would Cardinal Supich say the same thing if instead of a cohabitating gay couple, he was dealing with racists within parishes in Chicago?
No,
people, Catholics that were members of the KKK, let's say. Would he say, well, I know that they were raised as racists, and maybe this is the best they can offer God right now?
Of course not.
Try to extricate themselves from their racist upbringing. Of course not. Nobody would. You would just, you would say, stop that. That's wrong. That's exclusionary. That's immoral. You do not present yourself for communion after burning a cross, in somebody's front yard the night before. You can't do that.
Right.
Okay. But because it's sexual. All right. Oh, well, we have to tread lightly here.
Right.
Well, maybe we do. All right. I'm not arguing equivalency that racism, is whatever.
No. But it's always easier in our culture. Who isn't against racism? But if you get up, I often say that to the students. I mean, it's one thing who's not against racism, but get up as a priest in front of the congregation and give a sermon about cohabitation, or about
look out.
Right, exactly, or even about abortion, or about certainly homosexuality and all that. You're so. I think that it's unfortunate here. But, of the three principles that Francis has told us about reading Amoris Laetitia, read the whole document, he says. Well, of course, there are good things in that document. I think
lots of good things.
Yeah, I think he even affirms the core doctrine of Humani Vitae, that each and every single conjugal act has to be open to life. I don't know how these theologians in Rome now, who are trying to do something about that, I don't know how they interpret Amoris Laetitia in a different way.
Well, probably as ideals that you can then present from.
Ideals. Oh, that's another thing, of course. I often say that if Francis renders, the moral norms, since he doesn't accept moral absolutes, exceptionless moral norms, and he's trying to carve out a space there. That's the whole discussion about Thomas. He's not Thomistic, but he also, I think, the moral norm becomes it doesn't have an obliging force any longer in a specific situation. It has an aspiring force.
That's right.
It has an aspiring force.
An aspiring force. That's right.
An aspiring force. Of course, he recognizes it's a. He makes the distinction between objective and subjective morality. I remember also saying the first article I wrote was that it seemed to me that it was almost the case that Francis never actually recognized that anybody was guilty of doing something wrong here. Invincible ignorance became a kind of a dominant viewpoint.
That's why I call it, people have said this, Amoris is so Thomistic. Cardinal Schulenborg said it's Thomistic. Yeah. Others, well, maybe in some sense they see in it a Thomism, because he does acknowledge the ontological status of marriage and
right. Oh, yeah, that's
very traditional in that regard.
Absolutely.
But, it's a kind of, Thomas clarified.
Right.
Thomas didn't muddy the waters. So I have a hard time seeing Amoris as a Thomistic document. Because what he affirms in one hand, he then takes away later.
He takes away. Well, and as we've said, and as you said in your response to Gabrielle, and that is that Francis doesn't make the distinction between negative moral precepts that are exceptionalist moral norms and positive moral precepts that have presumptive validity, but for which there are situations where they're not applicable.
Yep. And
And
that's
if you
why
don't, everything is collapsed there. And that's why
yeah.
he's trying to carve out a space in which you could then, provide a justification for the divorced and remarried to receive communion. One last thing here, and that is, remember, he uses that passage, or he really yanks it from Gaudium et Spes, because and that's where the sort of proportionalism is, the dilemma. If you've made commitments, and you remarried, and you have children in that marriage, and what are the implications of leaving that relationship, or what are the implications of not having sex in that relationship if it's going to somehow damage your relationship? And so it seems to me he argues that you're going to be justified in a sexual relationship in that relationship.
Yeah, I do. But I would say sometimes I get emails and private messages. Well, then, what does this do about the infallibility of the church? I don't know. The deal is this: I don't think we have to worry that Pope Francis is going to issue an encyclical where he's simply going to reverse church teaching on a variety of things. More than likely, he will absolutely affirm the doctrinal truths of all of these moral norms that we're talking about.
Right.
But what he does, what his modus operandi is to then engage, as you have correctly identified, in this pastoral interpretation of the propositional truth of these moral doctrines, and say, well, that's all well and true on the level of ideas, but down here on the grunt level of pastoral, in the pastoral trenches, we have to make allowances for
we have to be where the people are at, as Supic says.
Yeah.
Where are the people?
That's right.
Where are the people? And
that's not it's not heretical. It's just silly.
Well, and in the end, it does lead to a denial of the basic truths about, like grace, that grace can transform you. John Paul II, paragraphs 102 to 104 of Veritatis Splendor makes
this
clear.
This is key. This is so key, and it's what people stop emailing me with. Why have you changed? Why? I have not changed, and I go back to what I said at the beginning. My hobby horse is the universal call to holiness. I am a Catholic worker. I'm Dorothy Day follower. John Paul II, Vatican II, the universal call to holiness.
Right.
Holiness is the vocation of every Christian. And it does seem to me that in this pontificate there is, look at the words of Walter Casper with regard to divorce and remarriage, Cardinal Casper, where he said, yeah, well, some people can live as brother and sister.
And some can't.
But most can't. And that's a kind of heroism you can't ask of the ordinary Christian. Bingo. That nails, in my mind, in one quote, the ethos of this pastoral approach that Pope Francis has adopted. And I think it's lethal. I think it's deadly to the faith to take that point of view.
Well, and it's so contrary. There's the passage where in, I think it's 102 of Veritatis Splendor, where John Paul says, the idea isn't to live according to what is possible for you now. The idea, what is possible for you as someone who lives in the gospel, in the power of Christ's redemption, and so on, as opposed to making it seem as if, like I always say, from when in St. Paul in 2 Corinthians, where he says that, the message of reconciliation is that God was in Christ reconciling the world, not counting men's sins against him. And then he says, you're ambassadors of the message, be reconciled to God, not be reconciled to God within the limits of what's possible for you now.
Right.
Or within the limits of what you can do now. No, of course, that's why when you sin, you go to confession. If we confess our sins,
where's the eschatological horizon?
Well,
where's the proper concept of mercy? Hey, but anyway, Dr. Echeverria.
Okay,
this is now officially the longest video interview that I have done with anybody. I could talk to you. I could just keep talking and talking to you.
All right. I know we have to stop.
But we should, to save the processing. My computer will process this now for 10 hours. So
okay.
I just want but I don't want to, give you the bum's rush here. Do you have any last words that you would like to throw in here? Any last comment? Any last insights?
Well, my insights. I would say, the church is currently under amnesia from, the pontificate of John Paul II and even the pontificate of Benedict XVI.
Yes.
John Paul II and Benedict XVI, it seems to me, put the council, Second Vatican Council, on its proper
Yes.
road. On its proper road. Let's go back and read. Not only read the documents of Vatican II. Let's go back and read. Remember in 1985 there was John Paul calling,
Extraordinary Synod.
Exactly, and he laid out. The Synod laid out 6 principles for properly interpreting, the texts of Vatican II. It seems to me those texts have a great value, fundamentally important. So let's go back and study John Paul II, his encyclicals, his writings, even his pre-papal writings. Let's go back. Love and Responsibility, for instance, is a great book. I know that in the mind of Francis, this is difficult and blah, blah, blah. Or even, the theology of the body, man and woman, he created them. I mean, that's a great book. I mean, also in terms of the Pope, I think there's development there in that the Pope develops the sacramental significance of sexual difference, and that you can't have a valid sacrament without sexual differentiation. Let's go back and read, John Paul, so that we can gain a proper orientation. Whatever we can learn from neo-traditionalists, I'm open, Bishop Schneider and so on and so on. I think even, Archbishop Lefebvre, there are questions that he raises there. Honest questions deserve honest answers.
Well, and I would point to modern, young, up-and-coming scholars like Dr. Matthew Minard, who is all about, resource theology, communio theology. I'm all in favor of that. That's great.
Right.
But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The scholastics did have a contribution to make.
Absolutely.
Maybe there are good elements of the neo-scholastic tradition that we also need to be retrieving.
Gilson, Maritain, these were great men, great Catholics. They understood many things.
Yes.
No, absolutely. Maritain's integral humanism, the person in the common good. These are all things.
Even people like Garrigou-Lagrange.
I just a couple of months back, I got his book on divine revelation, 2-volume work that was published.
I think Garrigou was wrong on nature and grace. I think he was wrong to criticize de Lubac.
He was wrong.
He was a bright guy.
There's no
his
question
stuff
about
is
it.
just. And so we need all of these resources. We need them all.
All of them.
And
unfortunately, we've lost that. I once gave. I used to go to I haven't gone for a couple of years, but I used to go to the Netherlands almost annually, twice a year, to give lectures at the Catholic Seminary in Amsterdam and in Haarlem, and in other places there. And I once gave an interview to the then Catholic newspaper that the church was suffering under amnesia. We've forgotten John Paul II, almost 28 years of papacy, his writings, etc.
Yeah.
And now we've forgotten Benedict. It doesn't help me if Francis goes and visits Benedict and gives him a hug and blah blah blah. Wonderful. So he wants to maintain a relationship there and all that. But intellectually, it just seems to me we need to recover those two papacies and what they were about. And they were not the pastorality of doctrine approach. They were not, recontextualizing and reinterpreting the gospel.
And I would say this too, that once Pope Francis passes on and we have another pope, that I would like to see even those elements of the Francis papacy that can be integrated into what can be. I think your book does a very good job of showing.
Sure. I have a chapter in my book on I call it an integral hermeneutics of life, which is really interpreting Francis, Gaudium et Spes. No, there's no question there are things that that are important. But on the other hand, there's been a lot more confusion. In my view, for instance,
yes.
the Francis's judgments about capital punishment, I don't think they'll stand, because it doesn't really provide the kind of rigorous, whatever conclusion one comes to on that. The fact is, his approach doesn't provide us with the rigorous.
Well, yeah, let's just put it this way. I'm opposed to the death penalty. I mean, I'm a student back in the day of Dr. Germain Grisey.
Sure.
He was opposed to the death penalty. Okay,
yeah, he was.
Nevertheless, I don't think you could just turn that into church teaching, because the church does have a perennial teaching on the death penalty.
Right, and anyway. So there are definitely things that I liked. There are many good things in Evangelii Gaudium, but in my view, it's gotten, and I hate to say this, I would never have said this about Benedict or John Paul II. It's gotten worse over time.
It has, and it seems to be accelerating of late.
Yes, absolutely.
So maybe as the Pope turned 85, maybe he senses.
Maybe, who knows?
Contrary to rumors, I don't think Pope Francis is dying. Nevertheless,
no, probably not.
He is 85 years old.
He is 85,
so,
right.
The Pope is not incapable of doing the math.
There's
I pray for him every day. I'm not one of those trads who hopes the Pope passes on.
No, I'm not going to say that. But
not at all. Not at all. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, and I actually love Pope Francis.
There's this
in many ways.
Meme on my Facebook page, and it's hitting at. The whole business about the liturgy and all these documents that have come out in the last year, and the Pope is in this boat, with others, vigorously trying to move away, and it's saying, "Oh, I'm for dialogue, but not with you."
Yeah, exactly, and that's the sort of, in my opinion, the whole problem with it is that it's inconsistent in its application of its own principles, and so it makes you wonder if they really are.
If you're for dialogue, why don't you invite the Neo-traditionalists to come into?
Well, here's an idea: instead of a synod on synod, why don't we have a synod on liturgy? Which seems
exactly synod on synod. The Lord help us.
Anyway,
all right, man. Good to talk.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much,
Dr.
Eduardo Echeverria, Francis, and his latest book.
II.
There we go. Thank you so much.
Take care.